Picture this. It's 1803. Thomas Jefferson just pulled off what might be the greatest real estate deal in human history. $15 million for 828,000 square miles of territory. That's about 3 cents per acre, folks. 3 cents. For comparison, that's like buying Manhattan today for the price of a decent sandwich. But here's the thing that gets me about the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson had absolutely no idea what he'd just bought. None. The map showed blank spaces marked unexplored territory. And here be dragons. Might as well have been written across half the continent. What Jefferson did know was that somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the known world, fortunes were waiting to be made. And when Americans hear there's money to be made, well, that's when things get interesting. The whispers started in St. Louis. Taverns and Kentucky farmhouses almost immediately. Beaver. Not just any beaver. Prime beaver with pelts so thick and lustrous that European hatmakers would pay astronomical prices for them. We're talking about streams so rich with beaver that trappers claimed you could walk across their backs without getting your feet wet. Exaggeration? Maybe. But here's what wasn't exaggerated. A single prime beaver pelt could fetch $6 in St. Louis. $6 when the average American worker made maybe $300 a year. Do the math. A successful trapper bringing in 200 pelts could make 4 times what a shopkeeper earned in 12 months of steady work. That kind of money makes men do extraordinary things. The first to answer that call was a man named John Colter. Now, Colter had already done something most people would consider crazy. He'd signed up for the Lewis and Clark expedition, agreeing to disappear into unmapped wilderness for 2 years, with no guarantee he'd ever see civilization again. But when the expedition reached the Mandan villages on their way back home in 1806, Colter did something that still makes me shake my head in wonder. He quit. He left the expedition. While everyone else was heading back to fame, promotions, and hot meals, Colter looked west at those endless mountains and said, "You know what? I think I'll stick around. Think about that decision for a moment. Lewis and Clark are packing up to return to a hero's welcome. President Jefferson is waiting to hear their reports. The entire civilized world wants to know what they found out there. And John Colter? He shoulders his rifle, waves goodbye, and walks alone into the most dangerous wilderness on the continent. What he found changed everything. Months later, and I mean months of complete solitude in Grizzly Bear and Blackfoot country, Colter stumbled back to civilization with stories that made people question his sanity. He talked about fountains of boiling water shooting 200 feet into the air, pools of mud that bubbled and steamed without any fire underneath, ground so hot you couldn't walk on it, rivers that ran warm in the middle of winter. People laughed. They called it Colter's Hell and figured the isolation had driven the poor man insane. Mountain fever, they said. Too much time alone with nothing but wolves and wind for conversation. But Colter wasn't crazy. He'd found what we now call Yellowstone. And more importantly for our story, he'd found beaver streams that were absolutely thick with the richest fur anyone had ever seen. Word spread. By 1810, Manuel Lisa's Missouri Fur Company was sending organized expeditions into the Rockies. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. These weren't just weekend camping trips we're talking about. Each trapper represented an investment that would make modern venture capitalists nervous. A Hawken rifle, the legendary firearm that became the mountain man's best friend, cost $300. $300 in 1810 money. That's more than most Americans made in a year. But without that rifle, you were dead. Period. The Hawken wasn't just a gun. It was a precision instrument capable of driving a half-ounce lead ball through a buffalo's heart at 200 yards. When your life depended on making that first shot count, you didn't economize on firearms. Then there were the traps. 6 steel beaver traps at $20 each. Another $120. These weren't just any traps. They were engineered pieces of equipment that could hold a 40-pound beaver underwater until it drowned. Designed to work in streams that might freeze solid for 6 months of the year. Each trap was hand-forged, individually tested, and carried the reputation of its maker stamped right into the steel. At powder, lead, knives, awls, flint, blankets, trade goods for dealing with Indian tribes, and a pack horse to carry it all. And you're looking at an investment of over $1,000 per man. In 1810, when you could buy a decent farm for less money. Now here's what makes this even more remarkable. Most of these men were farmers' sons and tavern workers who'd never seen a mountain in their lives. They were betting everything they had, everything they could borrow, and everything their families could scrape together on the chance that they could survive long enough in the wilderness to make it pay. And the wilderness they were heading into, it wasn't empty. The best beaver territory was controlled by the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the Blackfoot had very specific opinions about white men trapping in their lands. Their opinion was simple: kill them all. This wasn't just business competition, this was warfare. The Blackfoot had been fighting for control of these hunting grounds for generations. They knew every trail, every water source, every place where mountains funneled travelers into killing grounds. They were mounted warriors who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from a running horse. And they considered scalping enemy warriors not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary. The early trappers learned this the hard way. In 1823, a party of 13 men led by Hugh Glass was attacked by an Arikara war party. Glass survived by crawling 200 miles with a broken leg and infected wounds from a grizzly bear mauling. But that's another story entirely. The point is, this wasn't the kind of business where you worried about quarterly profits. This was the kind of business where you worried about whether you'd live to see another sunrise. But the money kept drawing them in. By 1825, the mountain fur trade was generating over $500,000 annually. Real money, hard currency flowing from European hatmakers to American trappers through streams and valleys that didn't appear on any map. And something extraordinary was happening in those unmapped places. These men weren't just trapping beaver. They were creating something entirely new, a culture that had never existed before and would never exist again. Part American entrepreneur, part Indian warrior, part European trader, they were becoming something that had no name because it had never existed before. They called themselves mountain men. Winter temperatures in the Rockies regularly dropped to 40 degrees below zero. That's cold enough to freeze whiskey solid. Cold enough that steel became brittle and would snap like glass. Cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. And a man who fell through ice into a mountain stream would be dead before he could crawl out. But spring brought the beaver runs, when thick winter coats made pelts worth risking everything for. And summer brought the gathering times, when men who'd spent months alone with nothing but their thoughts and the wind would come together to trade, drink, fight, and remind themselves they were still human beings. What they were creating, one beaver pelt at a time, was the opening of the American West. Every stream they trapped, every pass they discovered, every alliance they forged with Indian tribes was mapping the future of a continent. They didn't know it at the time. They were just trying to stay alive and make enough money to justify the incredible risks they were taking. But their footprints would become the trails that wagon trains followed. Their campsites would become the foundations of cities. Their knowledge of every water source, every mountain pass, every tribal territory would guide the expansion of an entire nation westward. The mountain men were thunder wrapped in buckskin, and they were about to unleash forces that would reshape not just the American West, but the entire relationship between civilization and wilderness, between individual ambition and cultural collision, between the known world and the spaces beyond the edge of every map. And it all started with beaver pelts and men crazy enough to risk everything for them. The stage was set. The players were moving into position. And what happened next would create legends that we're still talking about today. Step inside Jeremiah Strong's cabin in 1825, and you're entering a museum of survival. But this isn't some sterile display case. This is a working collection where every single object could mean the difference between life and death in the next 5 minutes. The first thing that catches your eye is his rifle. Not just any rifle, a Hawken. Serial number 112, crafted by Jake and Sam Hawken in their St. Louis workshop. Now I want you to understand something about this weapon. This isn't some mass-produced firearm we're talking about. Every Hawken rifle was built by hand, individually fitted, personally tested by the brothers themselves. They had a reputation to maintain, and that reputation meant that when a mountain man squeezed the trigger on a Hawken, something was going to die. The specifications tell the story. 54 caliber bore, capable of driving a half-ounce lead ball through a buffalo's heart at 200 yards. But here's what's really impressive. It could do that shot after shot, in weather that would make modern firearms specialists weep. 40 below zero. The Hawken worked. Driving rain that turned everything else into rust. The Hawken worked. Sandstorms that clogged every mechanism ever invented. The Hawken worked. Jeremiah paid $300 for that rifle. $300 when you could buy a good horse for $30. But here's the thing. That horse might get you out of one bad situation. The Hawken would get you out of 100. Right beside it, hanging from a leather thong, is his Green River knife. Stamped J. Russell and Company right into the blade. Mountain men had a saying about Green River knives. They cut so keen they'd split a hair floated on water. That wasn't marketing hyperbole. That was literal truth, and in the mountains, truth was the only thing that kept you alive. The knife blade is 10 inches of perfectly tempered steel that could skin a buffalo, defend your life in hand-to-hand combat, or perform delicate surgery on an infected wound. The handle is wrapped in buckskin that's been darkened by years of Jeremiah's sweat, blood, and the grease from countless meals eaten with fingers that trembled from cold, exhaustion, or fear. But here's where the story gets really interesting. This cabin doesn't just contain American technology and European trade goods. Hanging from the rafters is a crow medicine bundle, eagle wing, sweetgrass, and a perfect blue stone that the crow believe protects the spirit of anyone who carries it. This isn't some tourist souvenir. This is sacred medicine given to Jeremiah by a crow elder after he risked his own life to save a crow child from drowning. Now think about what that means. Here's a white man from Kentucky who's learned not just to respect native spiritual practices, but to integrate them into his own survival system. That medicine bundle isn't decoration. It's part of his equipment, as essential as his rifle or his knife. The cultural fusion goes deeper. Look at those 6 new house traps hanging from wooden pegs. Number 4 size, worth $20 each, capable of holding a 40-pound beaver underwater until it drowns. Pure American engineering. But the way they're arranged, the prayers that were said over them, the tobacco offerings made before they were first set, that's pure crow tradition. Jeremiah learned that successful trapping wasn't just about mechanical efficiency. It was about spiritual relationship with the animals you were taking. His winter count tells the story of cultural collision and adaptation better than any history book ever written. Painted on an elk hide in the pictographic style of the Plains tribes, it records 23 years of Jeremiah's life in the mountains. The year smallpox killed half the Mandan nation, a simple symbol showing spots on a human figure. The winter so cold that trees exploded from the frozen sap inside them, a drawing of a tree split down the middle. The spring he married Morning Star, daughter of a crow chief, 2 figures with hands joined. Surrounded by stars, each symbol represents not just an event, but a world where European diseases, American ambition, and native knowledge created something entirely new. Jeremiah Strong wasn't just a trapper. He was a cultural translator, learning to speak 3 languages fluently: the language of American commerce, the language of European technology, and the language of native survival. But let's talk about the trade goods, because this is where the global economy of the 1820s comes into sharp focus. Those glass beads filling the parfleche bags didn't come from some American factory. They came from Venice, Italy. Shipped across the Atlantic, transported up the Missouri River, carried on pack horses through mountain passes. Also, they could be traded for beaver pelts that would eventually end up as top hats on the heads of London gentlemen. The economics are staggering when you really think about them. A single strand of Venetian glass beads might cost 50 cents in St. Louis, but in the right hands, at the right moment with the right native trader, that 50-cent strand could purchase 5 beaver pelts worth $30 total. That's a 6,000% profit margin. Of course, you had to survive long enough to collect it, and survival meant understanding that every object in that cabin existed at the intersection of 3 different worlds. Take that steel awl on the workbench. American-made, designed for punching holes in leather. But Jeremiah uses it the way his crow wife taught him, not just for leatherwork, but for the precise placement of decorative quill work that turns a simple pair of moccasins into a work of art that carries spiritual significance. The powder horn hanging by the door is carved with Jeremiah's personal history, the date he first entered the mountains, the symbols of his spirit animals, the count of enemies killed in battle, its functional American technology decorated with native artistic traditions, creating something that had never existed before and would never exist again. Now here's what fascinates me about the material culture of the mountain men. Every single object in that cabin had to justify its weight. When you're traveling hundreds of miles on foot or horseback, through territory where an extra pound of gear might slow you down enough to get you killed, everything you own has to earn its place. That means the possessions that survived, the things mountain men chose to keep and carry and treasure, represent the absolute essentials of their world. Not just for physical survival, but for cultural survival. For maintaining some connection to the civilization they'd left behind while adapting to the wilderness that was trying to kill them. Look at those letters tucked into a wooden box near his bed. Letters from his sister in Kentucky, written in a careful hand that speaks of Sunday school education and parlor pianos. She writes about church socials and harvest festivals and the young man who's been asking about her. Her world of scheduled meals and predictable seasons and social conventions that everyone understands. And Jeremiah reads these letters by firelight while listening for war cries in the darkness outside. The contrast is almost incomprehensible. She's worried about whether her dress is appropriate for the county fair. He's worried about whether the Blackfoot war party that passed through yesterday is planning to come back tonight. But he keeps those letters, protects them from moisture and mice and the 1,000 dangers that destroy paper in the wilderness. Because they're not just communication, they're proof that the world he came from still exists. That there's still a place where people worry about normal things, where survival is assumed rather than earned minute by minute. The sacred and the practical live side by side in this cabin. A crucifix carved from mountain mahogany hangs next to a crow prayer pipe. A Bible with pages soft from handling sits beside a collection of medicinal roots that Morning Star taught him to identify. Christian hymns and crow healing. Songs occupy the same cultural space because survival demanded spiritual flexibility. This is what I find most remarkable about the mountain men. They created a material culture that had never existed in human history. Part European, part American, part native, but not quite any of those things completely. They were cultural pioneers, inventing new ways to live, new ways to think, new ways to understand the relationship between civilization and wilderness. And they did it one possession at a time. Each object carefully chosen, lovingly maintained, spiritually integrated into a worldview that was constantly adapting to circumstances that would have broken most people completely. Inside that cabin, surrounded by those carefully chosen possessions, Jeremiah Strong wasn't just surviving. He was becoming something new, something that had no name because it had never existed before. He was becoming a mountain man. Jim Bridger learned the first rule of mountain survival from a Shoshone war chief in 1828. White man thinks with his head. Shoshone thinks with his heart. Mountain man must think with both or mountain will kill him. The chief was right. The politics of the Rocky Mountains weren't something you could figure out with European diplomacy or American business sense. This was a world where the wrong gesture, the wrong gift, or the wrong word could mean the difference between safe passage and having your scalp decorating someone's lodgepole. But here's what's fascinating. The mountain men who survived, who thrived, who became legends, were the ones who figured out how to become cultural chameleons. They didn't just learn to survive in the wilderness. They learned to navigate the complex web of tribal politics, ancient rivalries, and shifting alliances that controlled every valley, every stream, every mountain pass in the Rockies. Take Thomas Fitzpatrick, known to every native tribe from the Columbia River to the Rio Grande as Broken Hand. Now, you might think that nickname came from some accident or injury. You'd be wrong. Fitzpatrick earned that name in 1829 when he needed safe passage through Crow territory to reach beaver. Streams that could make him rich. The Crow controlled the richest beaver territory in the northern Rockies. But they didn't negotiate in the European sense. They didn't sit around conference tables discussing trade agreements. If you wanted something from the Crow, you proved your worthiness through actions, not words. So Fitzpatrick did something that still makes me shake my head in amazement. He participated in their sun dance. Let me explain what that means. The sun dance isn't some ceremonial two-step we're talking about. This is a ritual where warriors prove their spiritual power by hanging from leather thongs pierced through the muscles of their chest, dancing until their own weight tears the thongs free, letting their blood mingle with the earth. Picture this: Thomas Fitzpatrick, Irish-American from St. Louis, allowing Crow warriors to pierce wooden skewers through his chest muscles, then hanging from those skewers while dancing for hours under the blazing sun, his blood streaming down his body, proving to an entire tribe that he understood sacrifice, that he respected their ways, that he was worthy of their trust. When those thongs finally tore free, leaving permanent scars on his chest, Fitzpatrick wasn't just another white trapper trying to get rich quick. He was Broken Hand, a man who had bled for the Crow, who had proven his courage in the most sacred way possible. Those scars bought him free passage through Crow territory for the rest of his life. More than that, they made him family, and that's the key word here, family. The successful mountain men understood that survival in the Rockies wasn't about individual heroics. It was about kinship networks, about creating bonds that went deeper than business transactions, about becoming part of the social fabric that held native societies together. Joe Meek took this understanding even further. In 1830, Meek married the daughter of a Nez Perce chief, but this wasn't some casual frontier romance. This was political alliance through marriage, creating bonds that extended protection across thousands of square miles of territory. When Meek's children were born, they belonged to both worlds. White father, native mother, raised with knowledge of both cultures, speaking both languages, understanding both ways of seeing the world. Those children weren't just Meek's legacy. They were living bridges between civilizations, human embodiments of the cultural fusion that was creating something entirely new in the American West. But the price of getting it wrong, that's where the story gets dark. John Glass, and this is a different Glass from the Hugh Glass of grizzly bear fame, learned this lesson the hard way in 1823. Glass was trapping along the Yellowstone River when he decided that Arikara territorial markers didn't apply to him. After all, he was an American citizen with every right to be there, according to the legal framework he understood. The Arikara had a different legal framework. They'd been controlling that stretch of river for generations. The painted symbols on trees, the carefully arranged stones, the specific ways that grass was bent, these weren't just decorations. They were international law, native style. They said clear as day, this is our territory. Enter at your own risk. Glass ignored them. Figured they were just Indian superstition. Set his traps anyway. 3 days later, Arikara warriors found his body scattered across 1/2 mile of prairie. His traps were gone. His horses were gone. His scalp was gone. The message was unmistakable. The rules apply to everyone, or they apply to no one. Here's what the successful mountain men understood that Glass didn't. Every trap you set, Every stream you fished, every camp you made, was a diplomatic act. You weren't just extracting resources from empty wilderness. You were entering someone's homeland, someone's sacred space, someone's hunting territory that their ancestors had defended for centuries. The smart mountain men carried gifts. Not just any gifts, carefully chosen items that showed cultural understanding. Mirrors that could capture souls, vermilion paint that could mark warriors for battle, metal arrowheads that could pierce Spanish armor, blankets in colors that had spiritual significance, beads arranged in patterns that told stories, but gift-giving had its own complex protocol. Give too little, and you looked like a cheapskate not worthy of respect. Give too much, and you looked either suspicious or stupid. Why would you part with valuable goods unless you were hiding something? Give the wrong thing, and you might accidentally declare war or propose marriage. Jim Beckwourth became a master of this diplomatic dance. Beckwourth was a mulatto from Virginia who found that his mixed-race heritage, which made him an outsider in white society, actually gave him advantages in the mountains. Native tribes were used to adoption, to bringing outsiders into the tribe through marriage or proven courage. Skin color mattered less than character. By 1833, Beckwourth had become a war chief of the Crow, leading raids against their traditional enemies, accumulating horses and honors and wives according to Crow custom. When white trappers met him in the mountains, they found a man who dressed like a Crow warrior, spoke like a Crow chief, and thought like someone who understood that survival meant becoming part of something larger than yourself. The cultural fusion went both ways. Native tribes were adapting too, incorporating European technology and American trade goods into their traditional ways of life. A Blackfoot warrior might carry a traditional war club alongside a Green River knife. A Crow woman might decorate traditional clothing with Venetian glass beads arranged in patterns that told the story of her family's spiritual power. This wasn't cultural destruction. This was cultural evolution, happening at a speed and intensity that had never been seen before in human history. But evolution isn't gentle. By 1830, over half of all mountain men had native wives, creating a network of kinship that stretched from the Columbia River to the Rio Grande. Every beaver hunt became a family affair. Every territorial dispute became personal. Every alliance or betrayal rippled through extended family networks that spanned multiple tribes and cultures. The children of these unions, the mixed blood, offspring of mountain men and native women, became the living embodiment of a new culture. They grew up speaking multiple languages, understanding multiple worldviews, moving easily between white trading posts and native villages. They were cultural interpreters, human bridges spanning the gap between civilizations that were learning to coexist. But they were also walking contradictions. Too white for some native societies, too native for white society, they belonged fully to neither world while carrying the knowledge of both. They would become the guides, the translators, the negotiators, who would shape the future of the American West. Kit Carson understood this better than most. Carson's marriage to an Arapaho woman wasn't just personal choice, it was survival strategy. Through her family connections, Carson gained safe passage through Arapaho territory, early warning of hostile war parties, and detailed knowledge of every water source, every hidden trail, every seasonal migration pattern across thousands of square miles. When Carson's wife died in childbirth in 1839, he didn't just lose a spouse. He lost his primary source of intelligence, his diplomatic immunity, his family connections that had kept him alive for years. The grief wasn't just personal, it was strategic. The mountain men were creating something unprecedented in human history, a hybrid culture that combined the best survival techniques from 3 different civilizations: European technology for precision and durability, American entrepreneurship for motivation and organization, native knowledge for understanding the land and its rhythms. But hybrid cultures are fragile things. They depend on constant negotiation, constant adaptation, constant willingness to see the world through someone else's eyes. And by 1835, forces were building that would test that flexibility to the breaking point. The beaver were disappearing. The fashion for beaver hats was dying out in Europe. Wagon trains were starting to cross the plains, bringing families who didn't want to adapt to existing cultures, but to replace them with something familiar. The age of cultural fusion was ending. The age of cultural collision was about to begin. And the mountain men, with their native wives and their mixed-blood children and their deep understanding of how different peoples could live together, were about to find out whether the world they'd created could survive the world that was coming to replace it. Picture the most outrageous marketplace you can imagine. Now multiply that by 10 and set it in a mountain valley where 800 mountain men, 3,000 Native Americans, and pack trains carrying $100,000 in trade goods converge for 16 days of the wildest commerce in human history. Welcome to the 1832 Rendezvous at Pierre's Hole. For 16 days every summer, a selected valley in the Rocky Mountains transformed into something that had never existed before and has never existed since. A combination county fair, stock exchange, diplomatic summit, and drunken brawl that determined the economic fate of everyone involved. Here's what you need to understand about the rendezvous system. It was the only link between the mountain men and the outside world. For 11 months of the year, these men lived in complete isolation, thousands of miles from the nearest store, post office, or newspaper. Then for 2 weeks in summer, civilization came to them in the form of pack trains loaded with everything they needed to survive another year in the wilderness. And I mean everything. Bill Sublette's wagon train to the 1832 rendezvous carried 40 barrels of grain alcohol, 300 pounds of tobacco, 2,000 pounds of coffee, 1,500 pounds of sugar, 5,000 pounds of flour, and enough trade goods to outfit a small army. The logistics alone boggled the mind, moving that much cargo across 800 miles of unmarked wilderness through hostile territory. Time to arrive at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. But here's where it gets really interesting. The economics of the rendezvous were absolutely brutal. Let's start with the alcohol, because that tells you everything you need to know about how this system worked. Bill Sublette bought grain alcohol in St. Louis for 50 cents a gallon. Pure 200 proof grain alcohol. But by the time it reached the rendezvous, it had been diluted into what the mountain men called mountain whiskey, 1 part alcohol, 3 parts creek water, seasoned with tobacco juice and red peppers to give it kick. That diluted mixture sold for $20 a gallon. $20. When a prime beaver pelt, the result of a week's dangerous work, brought $6. Do the math. A mountain man could trade more than 3 beaver pelts for a single gallon of watered-down whiskey. That's not just markup, that's economic warfare. But the mountain men paid it gladly, because for 11 months they'd been drinking nothing but creek water and pine needle tea. For 11 months they'd been alone with their thoughts and the wind. For 11 months they'd been wondering if they were still human beings or if they'd become something else entirely. That $20 gallon of mountain whiskey wasn't just alcohol. It was liquid civilization, proof that the world they remembered still existed, evidence that they hadn't completely lost their minds in the wilderness. The trade hierarchy at Rendezvous was as rigid as anything in European society, but infinitely more dangerous. At the top were the company partners, men like William Ashley and Andrew Henry, who financed the expeditions and took the lion's share of the profits. These men dressed in clean clothes, slept in canvas tents, and negotiated deals worth thousands of dollars while drinking actual whiskey, not the mountain variety. Below them were the company trappers, men who worked on salary and received their equipment on credit. These men were essentially indentured servants, trapped in a system where the company controlled both their supplies and their market. Everything they bought was marked up 2,000%. Everything they sold was marked down to wholesale prices. Most company trappers ended each rendezvous deeper in debt than when they arrived, bound to another year in the mountains, whether they wanted it or not. At the bottom were the free trappers, men like Jim Beckworth and Kit Carson, who owned their own equipment and negotiated their own deals. They had more freedom but also more risk. A free trapper could make a fortune in a single season, or lose everything to a Blackfoot war party and end up begging for employment with the companies they'd tried to compete against. The trading itself was theater of the highest order. Picture this: Jim Beckworth rides into the rendezvous with a pack train of beaver pelts, representing a year's work in the most dangerous territory on Earth. He survived grizzly bears, Blackfoot warriors, mountain storms that could freeze a man solid, and streams cold enough to stop his heart. His pelts are prime, thick, lustrous, perfect specimens that European hat makers will pay premium prices for. But at Rendezvous, Beckworth can't sell to European hat makers. He can only sell to company buyers who control the entire market. The company might offer him $4 per pelt for furs that will sell for $12 in St. Louis and $20 in London. Take it or leave it. If Beckworth takes it, he's got perhaps $800 in credit to spend at the company store, where everything costs 5 to 10 times what it would in St. Louis. If he leaves it, he's got a pack train full of furs, and no way to convert them to the supplies he needs to survive another winter. Most men took it. What choice did they have? But here's where the story gets really wild. Some men fought the system, and their fights became the stuff of legend. At the 1833 Rendezvous, Jim Beckworth lost his entire year's catch in a single night's poker game. $3,000 worth of beaver pelts, gone in 6 hours of cards and whiskey. By dawn, he was broke, drunk, and facing the prospect of signing on as a company trapper at subsistence wages. But Beckworth wasn't done. He challenged the winner to a knife fight, winner take all. Not a duel with rules and seconds. A knife fight, frontier style, where men circled each other with Green River knives until one of them was too dead to continue. The fight lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, Beckworth had his furs back, and his opponent was on his way to whatever mountain men went when their luck ran out. Justice, frontier style. That story became part of Rendezvous legend, told and retold around campfires for decades. But it also illustrates something crucial about the mountain man economy. Everything was personal. There were no insurance companies, no courts of law, no safety nets of any kind. Your word was your bond, your reputation was your credit rating, and your knife was your final arbitrator. The violence at Rendezvous wasn't occasional, it was constant. Men who'd spent months alone in the wilderness, men who'd survived by being quicker and deadlier than everything trying to kill them, suddenly found themselves crowded together with hundreds of other armed, dangerous, half-crazy individuals, all of them drunk on overpriced whiskey and years of suppressed civilization. Fights broke out over card games, over women, over insults real and imagined, over business deals gone bad. Kit Carson once fought a duel with a French trapper who claimed Americans couldn't shoot straight. They mounted horses and charged each other with loaded pistols. Carson put a ball through the Frenchman's wrist, settling the argument permanently. But the violence wasn't just between mountain men. The Rendezvous brought together tribes that had been enemies for generations, creating a powder keg of ancient grudges and territorial disputes. At the 1833 Rendezvous, a dispute over stolen horses between mountain men and Gros Ventre warriors exploded into a 4-hour battle that left 37 people dead and the valley floor soaked with blood. Yet somehow, incredibly, the system worked. For 20 years, the Rendezvous system moved hundreds of thousands of beaver pelts from Rocky Mountain streams to European hat shops, created fortunes and legends in equal measure, and kept the mountain fur trade profitable for everyone involved. Well, everyone except the actual mountain men. The companies made money. The suppliers made money. The transporters made money. The European hat makers made money. But the men who actually risked their lives trapping beaver in grizzly bear country, most of them died broke. Here's what gets me about the Rendezvous economy. It was simultaneously the freest market and the most manipulated market in American history. Free because there were no government regulations, no corporate oversight, no safety nets of any kind. Men succeeded or failed based purely on their ability to survive and produce, but manipulated because a handful of companies controlled every aspect of supply and demand, creating artificial scarcity and artificial abundance to maximize their profits. The mountain men understood this. They weren't stupid. They knew they were being exploited. But they also knew that without the rendezvous system, there was no mountain fur trade at all. The companies provided the capital, the logistics, the market connections that made the whole enterprise possible. The mountain men provided the labor, the risk, the knowledge that actually extracted wealth from the wilderness. It was a devil's bargain, but it was the only bargain available, and for 20 years, it created the most remarkable subculture in American history. Men who lived like medieval knights and died like ancient warriors, all in service of an economic system that treated them as expendable resources in the pursuit of European fashion trends. The 1835 rendezvous was the last great gathering. By then, beaver were nearly extinct in the accessible streams. Silk hats from China were replacing beaver felt in European fashion. The company partners could see the end coming and were already shifting their investments to other ventures. But the mountain men, most of them couldn't see beyond the next season, the next stream, the next chance to strike it rich. They'd spent so many years living moment to moment, survival to survival, that long-term planning had become a luxury they couldn't afford. The rendezvous system was ending. The age of the mountain man was ending, and most of the men who'd created that age were about to discover that the world had no place for their particular combination of skills. Courage and stubbornness. The last rendezvous was held in 1840. 47 men attended. 47 survivors of a way of life that had once employed over 3,000 people. They traded their remaining furs for supplies they probably wouldn't need, who drank whiskey that cost more than most Americans made in a month, and told stories about the way things used to be. Then they scattered to the four winds, carrying their memories and their scars and their irreplaceable knowledge of a wilderness that was already disappearing beneath the wheels of wagon trains heading west. Jim Bridger first noticed something was wrong in 1837. He'd been trapping the same stream for 12 years, a creek that wound through a valley so remote it didn't have a name on any map. For over a decade, that stream had produced 60 prime beaver pelts every season, regular as clockwork. Bridger could set his calendar by those beaver, but in 1837 he caught 6. 6 beaver from a stream that had been a gold mine of fur for more than a decade. At first, Bridger figured it was just bad luck. Maybe the beaver had moved to a different part of the valley. Maybe disease had hit the colony. Maybe the unusually harsh winter had driven them deeper into the mountains. Mountain men were used to lean seasons. The wilderness was unpredictable, and any man who expected guarantees was setting himself up for disappointment. But when Bridger expanded his search to neighboring streams, he found the same thing. Gnawed stumps where beaver lodges used to be. Abandoned dams slowly washing away in the spring floods. Silence where there used to be the sound of beaver slapping their tails in warning. The beaver weren't just scarce. They were gone. Here's what had happened, and the numbers are absolutely staggering. In 1820, when the mountain fur trade was just getting started, naturalists estimated there were 60 million beaver in the Rocky Mountain region. 60 million! That's roughly equivalent to the human population of the entire United States at the time. By 1835, after just 15 years of intensive trapping, that number had dropped to fewer than 10 million. By 1840, it was under 5 million. In some regions, the valleys that had been the richest, most productive beaver territory on the continent, the population had been reduced to literally zero. The mountain men had trapped the beaver nearly to extinction. Now, you might think this was inevitable. After all, these were professional trappers working for companies that had every incentive to extract as much wealth as possible from the wilderness. But here's what makes the story more complicated. Many of the mountain men understood exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. Native American tribes had been managing beaver populations for thousands of years. They took what they needed and left the rest. They rotated their trapping areas, allowing populations to recover. They had cultural taboos against taking breeding females during certain seasons. They understood that beaver were a renewable resource, but only if you treated them like one. The mountain men knew this. They'd learned trapping techniques from Native Americans. They'd married into tribes that had sustainable hunting traditions going back centuries. They understood the concept of conservation, but they also understood economics. And the economics of the fur trade rewarded short-term extraction, not long-term sustainability. Here's the brutal calculus that every mountain man faced. If you didn't trap every beaver in the stream this season, your competitor would trap them next season. If you left breeding pairs to maintain the population, you were essentially subsidizing your rival's future profits. In a market where companies controlled the prices and individual trappers had no market power, conservation was a luxury that could literally cost you your life. The tragedy wasn't that mountain men were ignorant of conservation. The tragedy was that they were trapped in an economic system that made conservation economically suicidal. Joe Meek learned this lesson the hard way in 1838. Meek had been one of the most successful free trappers in the business, a man who'd made and lost several fortunes in the beaver streams of the northern Rockies. But in 1838, he made a calculated gamble that would have made sense in any other business, but proved disastrous in the fur trade. Meek found a valley system that still had healthy beaver populations. Instead of trapping it out immediately, he decided to practice sustainable harvesting, taking only mature males, leaving the breeding females and young beaver to maintain the population. His plan was to work that valley for 20 years, creating a steady income stream instead of one big score. It was a brilliant plan. It was also a complete failure. By the time Meek returned the following season, other trappers had found his valley and stripped it completely. Not only had Meek lost his sustainable income stream, he'd also lost an entire year's worth of potential profits while practicing conservation that nobody else was willing to practice. The message was clear. In the mountain fur trade, nice guys finished dead, but even as the beaver disappeared, the market was shifting in ways that made their extinction economically irrelevant. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1835, American fur companies shipped 300,000 beaver pelts to Europe. By 1839, that number had dropped to 90,000. But here's the kicker. European demand for beaver felt had also collapsed. Silk hats from China were flooding European markets at $8 each, compared to $30 for a beaver felt hat. Fashion-conscious London gentlemen were abandoning beaver for silk almost overnight. The beaver hat, which had driven the entire mountain fur trade for 30 years, was becoming as extinct as the beaver themselves. Kit Carson found his last cache of beaver pelts in 1839, 500 prime pelts that he'd hidden in a cave system, planning to retrieve them when prices improved. Those pelts had cost him 2 years of his life, 2 years of dodging Blackfoot war parties, surviving mountain winters, living on jerky and hope. In 1835, those 500 pelts would have been worth $3,000. Enough to buy a farm in Missouri and live comfortably for the rest of his life. In 1839, Carson sold them for $500, $1 per pelt. The buyers weren't even sure they wanted them at that price. Carson took the money and tried not to think about what those 2 years had actually cost him. The mountain men tried everything to adapt to the changing economy. Some, like Carson, turned to hunting buffalo for the trading posts that were springing up along the emigrant trails. Buffalo hides sold for 75 cents each. Not much, but the buffalo was still plentiful, and a good hunter could kill 20 or 30 in a day. The work was brutal, and the pay was terrible, but it was work. Carson found himself guiding hunting parties of Eastern sportsmen who paid $50 to shoot a buffalo and have their picture taken with the carcass. $50 for an afternoon's entertainment. More than Carson made in a week of steady hunting. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years risking his life in the most dangerous wilderness on Earth, accumulating knowledge and skills that made him one of the most capable men on the continent. And now he was essentially a tour guide for wealthy amateurs. Other mountain men turned to guiding wagon trains, using their knowledge of every pass, every water source, every potential ambush site to shepherd settlers through their former hunting grounds. The pay was better, $25 per month plus supplies, but the work was heartbreaking. These men were literally guiding the destruction of the world they'd helped create. Every wagon train they led west brought families who would build farms and towns and churches where beaver streams used to run clear and cold. They were midwifing the birth of a civilization that had no place for them. Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick took a job with the Indian Agency, using his relationships with various tribes to negotiate treaties and prevent wars. The government paid him well, $100 per month, more than most Americans earned. But the work required him to convince his native friends and relatives to sign away their ancestral lands to make room for the settlers he was also helping to guide west. Fitzpatrick was caught between two worlds, trusted by both, belonging fully to neither. When his Crow wife died of measles brought by emigrants in 1842, Fitzpatrick realized that everything he'd worked to build, the cultural bridges, the kinship networks, the hybrid civilization that had made the mountain fur trade possible, was being destroyed by forces too large for any individual to control. His mixed-blood children faced an even crueler fate. Too white for many native societies, too native for white society, they belonged fully to neither world while carrying the knowledge of both. Some found work as interpreters and guides. Others drifted between frontier towns and reservation boundaries, never quite fitting in anywhere. The desperate formed raiding parties, stealing horses from Mexican ranches to sell in Missouri markets. It was dangerous work. The Mexican government was offering bounties for American scalps, and the route north was controlled by Comanche and Apache bands who didn't distinguish between horse thieves and legitimate traders. But it was also the only work that used the skills mountain men had developed, planning raids, moving fast across hostile territory, fighting when cornered, living off the land for weeks at a time. These were the abilities that had made them legends. If legitimate society had no use for those skills, illegitimate society would pay handsomely for them. Robert Newell tried a different approach. In 1840, Newell loaded his family and possessions into a wagon and drove them through South Pass, proving that families could follow the trails mountain men had blazed. It was a symbolic moment. The man who had spent 15 years traveling light and fast through the wilderness, carrying everything he owned on his back or his horse, now moved like a settler, weighted down with furniture and farming tools and all the apparatus of civilized life. Newell's successful crossing opened the floodgates. Within 5 years, 10,000 settlers were passing through South Pass annually, their wagon wheels erasing the very paths that had been secret highways of the fur trade. The mountain men watched from the sidelines as their trails became highways. Their campsites became towns. Their private wilderness became public territory. Some tried to profit from the change, opening trading posts and ferries to serve the emigrants. Others retreated deeper into the mountains, looking for valleys that hadn't been discovered yet, but there was no escape. The world they'd helped create, a world where individual courage and wilderness knowledge could make a man rich and free, was being replaced by a world that valued organization, capital, and collective action over individual heroics. By 1845, the transformation was complete. The last of the great fur companies had shifted their investments to other ventures. The last of the annual rendezvous had been held. The last of the major beaver streams had been trapped out or abandoned. The age of the mountain man was over. What came next would be something entirely different, an age of wagon trains and railroads, of territorial governments and federal troops, of family farms and industrial mining. The wilderness that had created the mountain men was disappearing beneath the advance of American civilization, and the mountain men themselves were becoming what they would remain for the rest of American history. Legends of a time when the West was still wild, when fortunes could be made with a rifle and a trap, when a man's only limits were his courage and his luck. They didn't know it yet, but they were already ghosts, haunting a world that no longer had room for the particular brand of freedom they'd fought so hard to preserve. Old Bill Williams died as he lived, alone in the San Juan Mountains in 1849, his frozen body found clutching the Hawken rifle he'd named Betsy, surrounded by wolf tracks and empty powder horns. When the search party finally located him 3 months after he'd gone missing, they found something that tells you everything you need to know about what the mountain men had become by the end. Williams had been carrying over $2,000 in gold coins. $2,000, enough to buy a mansion in St. Louis, enough to live like a king for years. But he'd died of starvation in country where he'd survived for 30 years, because the skills that had kept him alive in the age of beaver no longer worked in the age of gold rush. The world had changed. The mountain men hadn't. By 1850, the surviving mountain men had become living artifacts of a vanished civilization. Their knowledge was too valuable to waste, but their way of life was extinct. They were museums with legs, carrying irreplaceable information about a wilderness that was disappearing beneath railroad tracks and wagon roads. Jim Beckwourth understood this better than most. His cabin at Beckwourth Pass had become a trading post on the California Trail, where he spun tales for emigrants while selling them supplies at frontier prices. Flour at $30 per hundredweight, bullets at $1 each, horseshoes at $5 a set. But Beckwourth's cabin was more than a business. It was a shrine to a way of life that would never exist again. The walls displayed his entire history, a Crow war bonnet marking his chieftainship among the tribe, scalps from enemies both native and white, and a painting of his Crow wife who had died believing he would return from one more trapping expedition. Picture this scene. Emigrants from Ohio and Illinois, people who'd never been more than 50 miles from their birthplace, sitting around Beckwourth's fire while he showed them artifacts from a world they couldn't begin to understand. Here's the knife that killed 3 Blackfoot warriors in hand-to-hand combat. Here's the medicine bundle that protected him during the winter when temperatures dropped to 60 below zero. Here's the treaty pipe he smoked with chiefs whose names would never appear in any history book. The emigrants paid good money to hear these stories, 50 cents for an evening's entertainment, plus whatever they spent on overpriced supplies. But they listened the way people listen to fairy tales, not quite believing that such a world had ever really existed. Beckwourth knew they didn't believe him. Hell, half the time he didn't believe his own stories. Had he really been a Crow war chief? Had he really counted coup on over 100 enemies? Had he really lived for months at a time with no human contact, except the occasional trapper passing through his territory? Looking back from 1850, when California was filling up with gold miners and the first railroad survey crews were mapping routes through the mountains, the age of the mountain men seemed like something from a much older, more savage century, but it had been real. The scars on Beckwourth's body proved it. The permanent damage to his hands from years of setting beaver traps in freezing water proved it. The Crow words that still came to him more naturally than English proved it. He'd lived in a world where a man's life could change completely based on whether he saw wolf tracks heading toward his camp or away from it, where the difference between prosperity and starvation could depend on reading the weather signs correctly 3 days in advance, where survival required becoming part of the landscape so completely that you thought like the animals you hunted and moved like the wind that shaped the mountains. That world was gone. But its knowledge lived on in the few men who'd survived long enough to remember it. Kit Carson made the transition better than most, but at a cost that hollowed him out from the inside. Carson became a military scout, using skills learned trapping beaver to track Apache raiders for the United States Army. The pay was excellent, $100 per month, plus expenses, more than most officers earned. The work used all of his accumulated wilderness knowledge, required all of his hard-won survival skills, but Carson was essentially being paid to hunt people instead of animals. The Apache weren't beaver to be trapped for profit. They were human beings, fighting to preserve their way of life against the same forces that had destroyed the mountain men's way of life. Carson understood this. He'd lived among native tribes, married native women, raised mixed-blood children who belonged to both worlds. He knew that the Apache resistance wasn't savage violence. It was the same kind of desperate fight for survival that the mountain men themselves had waged against impossible odds. But Carson also understood that resistance was futile. He'd watched the beaver disappear. He'd watched the fur trade collapse. He'd watched wagon trains replace pack trains, and territorial governments replace tribal councils. The tide of American expansion was too powerful for any individual or tribe to resist, so Carson did his job. He tracked Apache war parties through desert country that would kill most men in 2 days. He found their hidden camps in mountain strongholds that seemed impossible to reach. He guided military columns through terrain that no white man had ever mapped. And every success felt like a betrayal of everything he'd once believed about the relationship between civilization and wilderness, between individual freedom and collective power. Jim Bridges' solution was different but equally heartbreaking. Bridges' fort became the last supply stop before the Mormon settlements, where he charged emigrants $50 to shoe their oxen while regaling them with stories they half believed. Bridger had become a professional liar, spinning tales that grew more outrageous with each telling. Petrified forests with diamond leaves that tinkled in the wind, glass mountains that were invisible until you crashed into them, streams that flowed uphill and springs that were so hot they cooked fish as they swam. The emigrants loved these stories. They paid good money to hear them. They repeated them around campfires all the way to California, adding their own embellishments until Bridges' tall tales became part of American folklore. But Bridges' real stories, the true accounts of 30 years in the wilderness, the actual history of cultural contact and adaptation and survival, those stories nobody wanted to hear. They were too complicated, too ambiguous, too dependent on understanding that the world wasn't divided into simple categories of civilized and savage, American and foreign, right and wrong. So Bridger told lies for money and kept the truth to himself, watching it die a little more each day. The most heartbreaking transformation belonged to the mixed-blood children of mountain men and native women. These children had been raised as bridges between worlds, speaking multiple languages, understanding multiple ways of seeing and being. They'd been living proof that different cultures could blend and create something new and valuable. But the world that was emerging after 1850 had no use for cultural bridges. It wanted clear categories, definite boundaries, us versus them. Mixed-blood children found themselves unwelcome in white society because of their native heritage, and increasingly unwelcome in native society because of their white connections. Some found work as interpreters and guides, using their linguistic skills to facilitate the same treaties and negotiations that were destroying their mothers' peoples. Others drifted between frontier towns and reservation boundaries, never quite fitting in anywhere, carrying knowledge that nobody wanted and memories that nobody understood. They were living embodiments of the cultural fusion that had made the mountain fur trade possible. But cultural fusion was exactly what the new American West was designed to prevent. Mariano Medina tried a different approach to preserving the mountain way. Medina kept every trap he'd ever owned, oiling them weekly, though beaver were extinct in his part of Colorado. His cabin became a private museum, filled with artifacts that told the story of a vanished world to anyone willing to listen. Medina's collection was extraordinary. Powder horns carved with personal histories that read like epic poems. Possibles bags beaded by wives who died of diseases brought by emigrants. Rifles that had spoken thunder across virgin wilderness and never missed when a man's life depended on accuracy. But Medina's most precious possession was something you couldn't see or touch. He remembered every stream he'd ever trapped, every trail he'd ever followed, every camp he'd ever made during 30 years in the mountains. He could navigate from memory across thousands of square miles of wilderness, moving by starlight through country that would leave modern GPS systems confused. That knowledge was priceless and worthless at the same time. Priceless because it represented the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent learning to read the natural world with superhuman precision. Worthless because the world no longer needed men who could do that. The railroad was coming. Telegraph lines were going up. Government survey crews were mapping every valley and cataloging every resource. The wilderness that had required individual knowledge and personal courage to navigate was being systematized, bureaucratized, made safe for people who didn't want to spend 30 years learning how to survive in it. By 1860, most of the surviving mountain men had been absorbed into the growing apparatus of American expansion. They worked as scouts for the army, guides for railroad construction crews, interpreters for Indian agencies. They used their wilderness knowledge to help build the civilization that was erasing the wilderness they'd called home. It was necessary work. It was well-paid work. It was work that used their unique skills and hard-won knowledge, but it was also the final irony of the mountain man era. The men who'd spent their lives learning to live outside civilization were spending their final years helping civilization eliminate every space where their way of life could survive. The last true mountain man may have been Hugh Glass, not the Hugh Glass of grizzly bear fame, but another Hugh Glass who disappeared into the Wind River Mountains in 1863 and was never seen again. Search parties found his horse, his supplies, even his rifle. But Glass himself vanished as completely as if the mountains had swallowed him. Maybe they had. Maybe Glass found what old Bill Williams had been looking for when he froze to death alone in the San Juans, a place where the old ways could still work, where a man could still live by his wits and his rifle and his knowledge of the natural world. Or maybe Glass just got tired of watching the world change and decided to step outside of history entirely, to become one more mystery that the mountains would never give up. Either way, his disappearance marked the end of something that had never existed before and would never exist again. The mountain men were gone. What remained were their stories, their artifacts, and the knowledge that for a brief, shining moment in American history, individual courage and wilderness wisdom had been enough to create fortunes, legends, and a way of life that still haunts the American imagination. The last keepers of the mountain way were dying off one by one, but they'd preserved something essential in their cabins and their memories and their carefully maintained possessions. They'd kept alive the proof that Americans had once been capable of extraordinary things, that the West had once been wild, that freedom had once meant something more than the right to choose between predetermined options. That proof would outlive them all. Walk into the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming today, and you'll find Jim Bridger's Hawken rifle resting behind bulletproof glass, insured for $2 million. $2 million for a piece of wood, steel, and brass that cost $300 when it was made in 1825. But here's what gets me about that price tag. It's probably too low. That rifle isn't just a firearm. It's a time machine, a direct physical connection to a world that existed for barely 30 years and changed the course of American history. When you look at that Hawken, you're looking at the tool that opened the American West, one beaver stream at a time. The serial number is still visible, 112. Which means Jake and Sam Hawken had made 111 rifles before they crafted this particular instrument of survival and death. Each one was built by hand, individually fitted, personally tested. When Jim Bridger shouldered that rifle for the first time in St. Louis, he was holding the accumulated knowledge of two master craftsmen who understood that in the Rocky Mountains there was no such thing as close enough. The rifle's provenance is documented with museum-quality precision. Bridger carried it for 23 years, from his first expedition with Ashley's company in 1822 until he sold it to an emigrant family in 1845. The family carried it to Oregon, where it hung over a farmhouse mantel for 40 years. Their descendants donated it to the Smithsonian in 1890, and it eventually found its way to Pinedale as part of a collection worth over $50 million. $50 million worth of artifacts from an industry that lasted 3 decades. Do the math. That's more than $1.5 million per year of historical significance. But the real value isn't monetary. It's mythological. Kit Carson's Possibles bag sits in a climate-controlled case nearby, and visitors stare at it without understanding what they're looking at. That leather pouch once held Carson's life. Fire steel for starting fires that meant the difference between survival and freezing to death, and all for emergency repairs that could save his life. Vermilion paint for diplomatic negotiations with tribes that could kill him or protect him, and letters from a wife who couldn't read but treasured every word he sent her. The bag is beautiful in the way that purely functional objects can be beautiful. Every stitch was placed with survival in mind. Every decoration had meaning beyond aesthetics. The beadwork pattern tells the story of Carson's Arapaho wife's family lineage. The fringe isn't ornamental. It's designed to shed water and help the bag dry quickly after river crossings. Museum visitors see primitive craftsmanship. What they're actually looking at is sophisticated engineering designed for the most demanding environment on Earth. The auction prices for authenticated Mountain Man artifacts have reached astronomical levels that would make art collectors jealous. A Green River knife owned by Jedediah Smith sold for $85,000 at a Sotheby's auction in 2015. A beaver trap authenticated as belonging to Hugh Glass fetched $120,000 at a Denver auction. House in 2018, $120,000 for a piece of steel that originally cost $20. That's a 6,000% return on investment over 2 centuries. Better than gold, better than stocks, better than real estate in Manhattan. But the collectors who pay those prices aren't investing in steel and leather. They're investing in stories, in the tangible proof that the legends were real, that men really did live the way the movies and novels claim they lived. And here's the thing, the legends are largely true. The Hollywood image of mountain men as lone warriors choosing freedom over comfort, risking everything for the chance to live life on their own terms. That's not romantic fantasy. That's documented historical fact. The deeper legacy of the mountain men extends far beyond museum displays and collector's items. The trails they carved while following beaver became the highways that still carry traffic across the American West. Interstate 80 follows the route of the Oregon Trail, which followed the paths that mountain men blazed in pursuit of beaver streams. Highway 20 parallels the route that Jedediah Smith took on his first expedition to California. Their trading posts evolved into the major cities of the American West. Denver started as a trading post where mountain men sold beaver pelts and bought supplies. Salt Lake City grew around Jim Bridger's fort. Spokane began as a fur trading center where mountain men and native tribes conducted the business that opened the Pacific Northwest. The economic infrastructure they created became the foundation for everything that followed. The supply chains that moved beaver pelts from Rocky Mountain streams to European hat shops became the supply chains that moved gold from California mines to eastern banks. Cattle from Texas ranches to Chicago stockyards. Wheat from Great Plains farms to international markets. But the mountain men's most enduring legacy isn't economic or geographic. It's psychological. They created and embodied the American myth of individual reinvention. The belief that a person can escape the circumstances of their birth and create themselves anew in the wilderness. This idea permeates American culture in ways so deep we barely notice them anymore. Every backpacker following GPS coordinates through Yellowstone is unconsciously following the example of John Colter, who walked alone into unknown wilderness and came back with stories that changed how Americans thought about their continent. Every family camping in the Rockies is sleeping where mountain men once listened for war cries and counted their remaining bullets. Modern outdoor gear companies explicitly market themselves as carrying on the mountain man tradition. Cabela's, Bass Pro Shops, REI, they all sell products designed for people who want to experience some version of what the mountain men experienced, even if only for a weekend. The irony is delicious. Mountain men spent years learning skills that could keep them alive in genuine wilderness, skills that required constant practice and total commitment. Modern outdoor enthusiasts spend thousands of dollars on gear designed to make wilderness safe and comfortable, to provide the experience of self-reliance without the actual risk of death. A modern hunting rifle costs more than Jim Bridges' entire outfit and is infinitely more accurate and reliable. Modern camping gear provides better protection from the elements than anything the mountain men ever dreamed of. GPS navigation eliminates the need for the kind of intimate geographical knowledge that mountain men accumulated over decades. We've systematically eliminated every challenge that made the mountain men extraordinary. Then we spend fortunes trying to recapture the feeling of being extraordinary. Survival. Schools across the American West charge $3,000 to teach weekend warriors skills that Joe Meek learned because he had to or he'd die. Corporate team-building exercises use mountain man themes to teach collaboration and leadership to people whose biggest occupational hazard is carpal tunnel syndrome. Hollywood has transformed the mountain men into American samurai, lone warriors, operating by a code of honor that values courage over comfort, freedom over security. The reality was more complex and more interesting than the mythology. But the mythology serves an important function in American culture. The mountain men represent the last time in American history when individual courage and personal skill could make someone genuinely free. Not free in the legal sense, they lived outside the reach of law entirely. Free in the existential sense, their survival depended on their own abilities, their own knowledge, their own willingness to risk everything on their own judgment. That kind of freedom is simultaneously attractive and terrifying to modern Americans. We want to believe it's still possible, but we're not willing to pay the price it actually costs, because the price was everything. The mountain men gave up families, comfort, security, and usually their lives in exchange for a few years of absolute self-reliance. Most of them died young, broke, and forgotten. The survivors were often broken by the experience, carrying physical and psychological scars that never healed. But for a brief moment in American history, they achieved something that human beings had never achieved before and will probably never achieve again. They created a way of life that was genuinely free, genuinely self-determined, genuinely dependent on individual excellence rather than collective organization. The artifacts in museum cases are all that's left of that achievement, but they're enough to keep the dream alive, to remind us that Americans once did impossible things, that the West was once wild, that freedom once meant something more dangerous and more valuable than the right to choose between pre-selected options. Every year, millions of people visit these museums, staring at these artifacts, trying to understand what it meant to live that way. Most of them can't really comprehend it. The gap between their world and the mountain men's world is too vast to bridge with imagination alone. But some visitors, a few in every crowd, look at Jim Bridges' rifle or kit, Carson's Possibles bag, or a beaver trap that once held 40 pounds of struggling fur underwater, and they feel something shift inside themselves. They realize that the comfortable, predictable, safety-netted world they inhabit isn't the only way human beings can live. They realize that their ancestors, not that many generations back, lived in ways that required daily courage, constant adaptation, and absolute self-reliance. They realize that the capacity for that kind of life is still encoded in their DNA, waiting for circumstances that will call it forth. Most of them go back to their air-conditioned cars and drive home to their mortgaged houses and their office jobs and their 401k plans. and the feeling fades, but it never completely disappears. The mountain men planted seeds in the American imagination that still sprout in unexpected places. At unexpected times, those seeds carry the DNA of American mythology, the belief that individuals can remake themselves, that wilderness still exists for those brave enough to find it, that freedom is worth any price, and that the horizon always promises a chance to start over. The mountain men themselves are gone. Their world is gone. Their way of life is gone. But their ghosts still haunt the American West, whispering from museum cases and mountain peaks and lonely trails that somewhere, somehow there are still beaver streams waiting to be trapped, still fortunes waiting to be made, still chances to prove that courage and skill and a good rifle can make a person free, and maybe, just maybe, they're right.